Kale Duran was not supposed to be anywhere near the creature. He was supposed to be on the other side of the outpost, helping carry supply crates from the landing dock to the storage units. That was his job today. Simple, quiet, nothing exciting. Just boxes and crates under the pale orange sky of Vorkai Prime. But then he heard the sound. It came from the far end of the outpost, past the tall metal fencing and the rows of equipment sheds. It was a deep, low sound, like thunder trapped inside something alive. It rolled through the ground and up through the soles of his boots. Kale stopped walking. He tilted his head. The other workers kept moving, eyes down, not looking toward the sound at all. That told him something right away. Whatever was making that noise, everyone else already knew to stay away from it. Kale set down his crate and walked toward it. The outpost on Vorkai Prime was large and busy. It sat on the edge of a flat, rocky plain, surrounded by dark mountain ridges that turned purple in the early morning light. The Vorkai who ran the outpost were tall, scaled, and precise in everything they did. Their golden and dark green scales caught the light when they moved. They wore their ranks on their chest plates and walked like every step meant something. They were not rude to the humans stationed here, but they were not warm either. They were professional, efficient. They noticed everything and explained very little. There were only 11 humans at the outpost. Kale was the youngest of them, 24 years old, originally from a small town in Oregon. He had taken the off-world labor exchange posting because the pay was good and because he had always been curious about things that most people walked away from. That habit had served him well sometimes. Other times it had gotten him into trouble. Today it walked him straight to a massive reinforced enclosure at the far end of the compound. The fencing around it was heavy and layered. 3 separate barriers with electric current running through the outer 2. Warning signs in 4 languages covered every post. 2 Vorkai soldiers stood at the entrance with long pulse rifles held across their chests. They were not relaxed. Their eyes moved constantly. Their tails, which usually swayed slowly when Vorkai were calm, were completely still. Inside the enclosure, something enormous moved. Kale stopped at a distance and just looked. The creature was called a breth. He had heard the name once or twice from the other workers, always spoken quietly and always followed by a change of subject. Now he understood why. The breth was massive. It stood on 4 thick legs, each one the size of a mature tree trunk. Its body was long and heavily built, covered in dark, scaled armor that looked almost black in the shadow but shifted to deep red where the light touched it. Its neck was long and powerful, and its head was broad and angular with 2 ridged horns that curved back like swept wings. Its tail dragged slowly behind it, scraping the stone floor and leaving marks in the rock. It was pacing. Not wildly, not frantically. It moved with a slow, heavy purpose, back and forth along the inner wall of the enclosure. Every few steps it would stop, lower its head, and make that low thunder sound again. The vibration reached Kale even at this distance. He stood there and watched it for a long time. Around him, he gradually noticed more people. A group of Vorkai officers stood together to his left, talking in low voices. A few workers watched from behind a shed, not stepping any closer. And on the elevated platform above the enclosure entrance, several figures in finer clothing observed from above. One of them was clearly important. The others stood slightly behind him, which usually meant rank. Kale did not pay much attention to them. He was watching the breth. Something about the way it moved bothered him. It was not just restless. It was uncomfortable. He had grown up on a farm. He had been around horses, cattle, working dogs, and once a very unhappy black bear that had gotten into the equipment barn. He knew the difference between an animal that was aggressive and an animal that was in pain. The breth was both, but the pain was coming first. He stepped closer. He did not think much about it. He just moved forward slowly, not rushing, keeping his body relaxed. He stopped about 4 meters from the outer fence, close enough to see clearly. The breth continued its pacing for a moment, then stopped. It turned its head. It looked directly at Kale. Kale looked back. He did not step away. He did not raise his hands or make any motion. He just stood there, weight even on both feet, breathing normally. He looked at the creature the way he used to look at the injured animals his father brought in from the fields, with attention, with patience, without judgment. The breth held still for a long moment. Then it made a different sound, lower, shorter, like a question. Behind Kale, someone made a sharp noise of surprise. He heard urgent whispering in Vorkai language. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the breth, which was now watching him with what could only be described as focused curiosity. On the platform above, the important figures had gone quiet. One of them leaned forward slightly, gripping the railing. She was young for someone dressed in imperial colors, and her golden scales were bright even in the pale morning light. Her eyes were fixed on the human standing alone and completely calm in front of a creature that had put 6 trained Vorkai handlers in the medical bay in the past 2 weeks. Princess Sariva said nothing. She just watched. Commander Zyrath was not a patient creature. He had served the Vorkai military for 31 years. He had managed outposts on 4 different planets. He had dealt with difficult soldiers, broken equipment, political complications, and once, a full-scale worker revolt on a mining station near the outer belt. He had handled all of it with cold efficiency and very little emotion. But right now, standing across a metal table from a young human who looked like he had just taken a casual afternoon walk, Commander Zyrath felt something unfamiliar sitting in his chest. It was somewhere between confusion and irritation, and he did not enjoy either one. He stared at Kale for a long moment before speaking. "You walked toward the breth," Zyrath said. His voice was flat and precise, like a blade laid on a table. "Without armor, without a weapon, without authorization." Kale nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. 6 of my trained handlers approached that creature with full protective gear and pulse deterrents. 2 of them are still receiving treatment." Zyrath leaned forward slightly. "You walked up to the outer fence in a work shirt and stood there like you were watching the sunset." Kale did not smile, but something in his expression stayed calm in a way that seemed to bother Zyrath more than any argument would have. "I was just looking at it," Kale said. "I wasn't trying to do anything. I heard the sound it was making and I got curious." "Curious," Zyrath repeated, like the word tasted strange. "Yes, sir." Zyrath straightened up. He clasped his hands behind his back and walked slowly to the side of the room, looking out through the narrow window at the compound below. The breth enclosure was visible from here. The creature was still now, which was unusual. It had not been still since it arrived. "Explain to me," Zyrath said without turning around, "why it did not charge the fence when you approached. My handlers triggered a full attack response just by entering the outer zone." Kale thought about it for a moment. Not because he was nervous. He just wanted to say it correctly. "I didn't come at it with tension," he said. "I think it could feel the difference. Animals read what you're carrying before they hear what you're saying. If you come in tight and braced for a fight, they feel that. The breth probably had 6 people approach it who were already afraid of it, already gripping weapons, already expecting it to attack. So it did." Zyrath turned and looked at him. "You are saying my trained handlers caused the attacks?" "Not caused," Kale said carefully. "I'm saying the creature was responding to what they brought with them. That's not a failure on their part. They had good reason to be cautious. I just didn't know enough to be scared yet." There was a silence in the room. From the corner near the door, a voice spoke quietly. "That is actually a reasonable observation." Both of them turned. President Sariva had been standing near the entrance since the meeting began, mostly still and mostly quiet. Zyrath had briefed her as a courtesy since she was present at the incident. He had not expected her to speak. She stepped forward slightly. She was looking at Kale with an expression that was hard to read. Not warm exactly, but open, thoughtful. "The breth was captured 6 weeks ago," she said. "It was transported in a containment box for 11 days. It arrived injured, and it has been handled only by people who were afraid of it, or people who wanted to control it." She paused. Neither of those things would make any creature calm. Zyrath looked at her carefully. Princess, the breth is a war asset. The handling protocols are standard. The standard protocols have not worked, she said simply. She looked at Kale again. You mentioned it was responding to tension. What would you do differently? Kale blinked. He had not expected to be asked that. He had expected to be given a formal warning and sent back to carrying crates. I'd start by just being near it, he said, not doing anything, not asking anything from it, just being present without pressure. Then I'd bring food, something with a strong smell it can track, so it starts connecting my presence with something good. And I'd look at the wound. Zirath stiffened. What wound? On its left side, just behind the front leg. There's something there. The way it holds that side when it turns, it's protecting it. Has anyone treated it? The silence that followed answered the question. Sariva looked at Zirath. The commander's expression shifted through several things at once. He was a proud creature, and the question had landed in an uncomfortable place. He said nothing. Sariva turned back to Kale. If I granted you supervised access to the enclosure, outer zone only, would you be willing to try? Kale looked at her, then at Zirath, then back at her. Yes, he said. Zirath looked like he had several things to say and was choosing very carefully between them. Finally, he let out a slow breath through his nose. Supervised access, outer zone, 2 guards at all times, and the human signs a full liability release before he goes within 20 meters of that fence. Kale agreed without hesitation. 3 days later, he was sitting cross-legged on the ground 4 meters from the inner fence, with a piece of dried protein ration held loosely in one hand, and absolutely nothing happening. The breth watched him from the far end of the enclosure. It had not moved toward him. It had not made any sound. It simply watched with those huge amber eyes, still and measuring. Kale sat there and waited. He had nowhere else to be. On the 4th day, Rock took one slow step forward. Kale did not move. He just kept breathing. But somewhere in his chest, something quiet and warm settled into place. Behind him, at a careful distance, one of the guards whispered something to the other in Vorkai. Kale did not understand the language well, but he understood the tone. It was disbelief. Word travels fast in a small outpost. By the 5th day of Kale's visits to the enclosure, people were finding reasons to walk past that end of the compound. A Vorkai technician would take a longer route to the equipment shed. A pair of soldiers on a break would lean against the far wall and pretend to talk while their eyes moved toward the inner fence. Even some of the other human workers started drifting over during rest periods, standing at a quiet distance and watching. Nobody said much. They just watched. And what they saw was hard to explain if you had not seen it yourself. Kale would arrive each morning with food, always the same time, always the same calm walk. He would sit down on the ground near the outer fence, set the food within reach, and just exist there for a while. No sudden movements, no loud sounds, no equipment. Just a young man sitting on rocky alien ground like he had all the time in the world. Rock had stopped staying at the far end of the enclosure. By the 3rd day, the breth had been coming to within 6 meters of where Kale sat. By the 5th day, it was close enough that Kale could see the texture of its scales clearly, the way the dark red color deepened near the ridges of its back, the slow rise and fall of its heavy sides when it breathed. The wound was worse than Kale had originally thought. It ran along the left side just behind the front leg, partially hidden under a folded section of scale. The skin beneath was dark and swollen, and when Rock shifted its weight, Kale could see the faint tension in its neck that meant the movement was pulling at something that hurt. He had been watching it carefully for days, calculating, waiting for the right moment. On the 6th day, he brought a small medical kit. He had asked the outpost medic, a quiet Vorkai named Dress, for the basics. Clean solution, soft application cloths, a topical treatment that worked on scaled skin. Dress had handed them over without much comment, though his eyes had held a question he did not ask out loud. Kale sat down in his usual spot. He set the food to the side as always. Then he placed the medical kit on the ground in front of him and opened it slowly, making no sharp movements. He wanted Rock to see it, to smell it, to decide what it was before anything happened. Rock watched from 3 meters away. The Vreth's amber eyes tracked the kit, then moved back to Kale's face. Kale looked back at it the same way he always did. Steady, unhurried. Like they had done this 100 times already. He spoke quietly. He did not say anything important. He just talked, low and even, the way you talk to a nervous horse when you're reaching for its leg. He talked about the morning, about the purple color of the mountains, about how the sky on this planet never quite got fully bright, just shifted between shades of orange and gray. The words did not matter. The voice did. Rock lowered its head. It was a slow movement, deliberate, the huge angular skull coming down until it was nearly level with Kale's seated height. The horns on its head caught the light. Kale stayed completely still, let the creature close the last of the distance between them, let its breath wash over him. It smelled like hot stone and something metallic. He did not flinch. Then, very slowly, he reached out and placed his hand flat against the side of Rock's jaw. Behind him, he heard one of the guards make a sharp, involuntary sound. He heard boots shift on the ground, the quiet tension of someone reaching for a weapon and then stopping themselves. Rock did not move. Kale kept his hand there for a moment, then moved it gently along the side of the creature's neck, slow and deliberate, working his way toward the injury. When he reached the area near the wound, he stopped. He picked up the application cloth with his other hand, soaked it, and began cleaning the edges of the damaged skin with the most careful movements he had ever made in his life. Rock made a sound. It was that low, short sound, the one Kale had started thinking of as a question. The creature's body tensed for just a moment, and then gradually, slowly, released. It stood there and let him work. It took 20 minutes. Kale cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied the treatment, and sat back when he was done. His hands were shaking slightly, he noticed, not from fear, just from the concentration. He let out a long breath and looked up at Rock. The Vreth was watching him. Then it did something none of the observers had ever seen it do since its arrival on Vorkai Prime. It lay down, slowly, heavily, folding those enormous legs beneath its body and settling onto the ground with a deep exhale that sent a small cloud of dust drifting across the enclosure floor. It lay down next to Kale. For a long moment, nobody at the outpost made any sound at all. Then, from the elevated walkway above the compound, where she had been standing quietly for the past 40 minutes, Princess Sariva exhaled slowly. She had her hands resting on the railing, and she did not move them. She was looking down at the human sitting beside the creature that her father's best handlers had failed to approach, and she was thinking about something she could not quite put into words yet. Beside her, a senior Vorkai officer cleared his throat carefully. "Princess," he said, "should we report this to the Emperor?" Sariva watched Kale reach out and rest one hand on Rock's scaled side, calm and easy, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes," she said quietly, "we should." The Emperor of the Vorkai Empire did not travel lightly. When his ship descended through the orange sky of Vorkai Prime 3 days after Sariva sent her report, it came with 2 escort vessels, a full honor guard, and enough Imperial staff to fill the outpost's main building twice over. The landing shook the ground. The shadow of the ship passed over the compound like a slow-moving cloud, and every worker and soldier on the outpost stopped what they were doing and stood straight. Kale watched the landing from near the enclosure. Rock watched it too, head raised, eyes tracking the ship with calm attention. The Vreth had been noticeably more settled in recent days. It still paced sometimes in the evenings, but the long, tense silences had softened. It ate regularly now. The wound on its side was already showing early signs of healing, the swelling reduced, the skin around it less dark. Kale gave it a piece of dried protein and turned to watch the Emperor step off the ship. Emperor Vorath was older than Kale had imagined. His scales were deep gold, darker than Sariva's, with the kind of weight to them that came from decades rather than birth. He was tall even by Vorkai standards, and he moved slowly, not from weakness, but from the habit of someone who had never needed to hurry because everything waited for him. His eyes were sharp and pale, almost silver, and they moved across the outpost with the quiet efficiency of someone counting and measuring everything they passed. Commander Zyrath met him at the base of the landing ramp with a formal bow and a full report delivered in clipped, precise sentences. The Emperor listened without expression. Sariva walked 2 steps behind her father, her own face composed and still. She did not look at Kale directly, but when the group began moving across the compound, she guided the direction so subtly that only someone paying close attention would notice. They stopped at the enclosure. The Emperor looked at the breth for a long time without speaking. Rock stood near the center of the enclosure, watching the new arrivals with those steady amber eyes. The creature did not pace. It did not lower its head in threat. It simply stood and observed, which was already more than it had done for any visitor since its arrival. Then Emperor Vorath looked at Kale. It was the kind of look that took a full inventory. Age, size, posture, expression. Kale stood quietly and let it happen. He had learned a long time ago that trying to fill a silence with words usually made things worse. "You are the human," the Emperor said. His voice was deep and measured. "Yes," Kale said. "Kale Duran." "You have no military rank?" "No." "No special training in creature handling?" "I grew up on a farm," Kale said. "I've worked with animals most of my life. Nothing like a breth, but the basics are the same." The Emperor's pale eyes moved back to Rock. "My handlers were trained for 11 years. 2 of them will carry the injuries from this creature for the rest of their lives." He paused. "You treated its wound with a cloth and some solution?" "Yes, sir. And it allowed this." "It allowed it because it understood I was trying to help," Kale said. "It's not a simple creature. It knew the difference." There was a silence. Around them, the honor guard stood perfectly still. Commander Zyrath looked at a fixed point on the middle distance, the way soldiers do when they want to appear neutral. The Emperor spoke again. "I want a demonstration." Kale nodded once. He turned toward the enclosure entrance, where one of the guards moved to unlock the gate. This was the moment that made the honor guard shift slightly, weight moving forward, hands closer to weapons. Nobody said anything, but the air changed. Kale walked in. He did not look back. He walked at his usual pace, relaxed and even, across the open ground of the enclosure toward where Rock stood. The breth watched him come. Its tail moved once, a slow side-to-side motion that Kale had come to recognize as something close to acknowledgement. He stopped a few steps away and just stood there. Rock stepped forward and lowered its head. The huge skull came down slowly and rested, very lightly, against Kale's shoulder. The weight of it alone could have knocked him flat if the creature had not been careful. It was careful. Kale reached up and placed his hand along the side of the breth's jaw, and the 2 of them stood there together in the middle of the enclosure like they had done it 100 times. Because they had. Outside the fence, nobody moved. The Emperor stood very still. His expression had not changed, but something behind his pale eyes had shifted, some interior calculation running that had not been running before. Sariva stood beside him with her hands folded and her eyes bright. Kale walked slowly to the left. Rock walked with him. He stopped. Rock stopped. He sat down on the ground. Rock lowered itself beside him, that great weight settling into the ground with a quiet rumble, and rested its head on the earth near Kale's knee. The Emperor watched all of it. Then he did something that made Commander Zyrath's eyes widen slightly. He walked to the enclosure fence himself, stopping just at the outer edge, and he spoke directly to Kale in a voice that had lost its formal distance. "Why did it trust you?" Kale looked up from where he sat beside Rock. He thought about the question honestly, the way he always did. "Because I never tried to own it," he said. "I just tried to understand it." The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved across the compound. The mountains in the distance sat purple and still under the pale sky. Rock breathed slowly beside Kale, deep and even, completely at rest. Emperor Vorath turned to his daughter. She was already looking at him, and for the first time in the visit, she was smiling. The Emperor did not make his decision immediately. That was not his way. Emperor Vorath had ruled the Vorkai Empire for 26 years by thinking carefully before speaking and never letting anyone see the full shape of his thoughts until he was ready. He walked back to the main building after the demonstration with his staff around him and his expression completely unreadable, and the entire outpost quietly held its breath for the rest of the afternoon. Kale went back to the enclosure. He was not nervous about the Emperor's decision. He had said what he meant and shown what he could show. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. So he sat with Rock as the light shifted from pale orange to a deeper amber in the late afternoon, and he cleaned the wound again, and he talked quietly about nothing important, and Rock lay beside him with the slow, patient stillness of a creature that had finally found something it had not known it was missing. Commander Zerath found him there an hour later. The commander stood outside the fence for a moment before speaking. He was not a creature who wore discomfort easily. He stood straight, hands clasped behind his back, tail moving in that slow, controlled way that meant he was working through something internally. "The Emperor will speak with you after the evening meal," Zerath said. Kale nodded. "Thank you for letting me know." There was a pause. Zerath looked at Rock, who was watching him with calm, amber eyes. "When you first approached the enclosure," Zerath said slowly, "I thought you were either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Kale said. Something moved at the edge of Zerath's expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. He was quiet for another moment, then he reached through the outer fence and held out his hand, palm flat, fingers together. It was the Vorkai formal gesture of respect, the one reserved for those who had earned it genuinely, not just through rank or ceremony. Kale stood and reached through the fence and met it with his own hand. Zerath held the grip for 3 seconds, which was the full formal count, then released it. He straightened up, nodded once, and walked back across the compound without another word. Kale sat back down beside Rock. "I think he likes us," he said quietly. Rock made the low, short sound that Kale had decided meant something between agreement and mild indifference. Kale smiled. The meeting with the Emperor took place in the outpost's main conference room after dark. The Imperial staff had cleared out, and it was only Emperor Vorath, Sariva, Zyrath, and Kale. The room felt different with fewer people in it, quieter, more honest somehow. The Emperor sat at the head of the table and looked at Kale for a moment before speaking. "I have been thinking about what you said," Vorath began, "that you never tried to own it. You tried to understand it." He paused. "We have a long tradition in the Vorkai military of training war beasts through strength and dominance. It has worked for generations. Our breth handlers are among the finest in the Empire." Kale said nothing. He listened. "But our finest handlers could not do what you did in 6 days," the Emperor continued. "And I have been sitting with that fact all afternoon." He leaned forward slightly. "I am not a creature who enjoys being wrong, but I am also not a creature who ignores what is directly in front of him." He placed both hands flat on the table. "I am offering you a position, Kale Duran, the first official human and Vorkai wildlife liaison. You would be based here on Vorkai Prime. Your work would be to develop a new framework for how we understand and work with native creatures, starting with the breth. You would have resources, staff, and direct communication with my office." The room was very quiet. Kale looked at the Emperor, then at Sariva, who was watching him with that open, thoughtful expression he had come to recognize. Then back at the Emperor. "I would like that very much," he said. Vorath nodded slowly. "There is one condition. You continue to care for Rock. That creature has not been calm since it was captured. Whatever you have given it, I do not want that undone." "I wasn't planning on stopping," Kale said. Something shifted in the Emperor's face. It was small and brief, but it was there. A warmth behind the silver eyes that his imperial composure could not quite contain. He stood, and everyone in the room stood with him. He looked at Kale one last time with an expression that had no performance in it. "You are a strange creature, Kale Doran," he said, "but perhaps that is not a bad thing." Then he left, and the room exhaled. Sariva stayed behind. She waited until the door closed, and then she crossed the room slowly and stopped a few steps from Kale. She was not in her formal imperial posture now. She stood like a person, not a princess, and there was something quieter and more genuine in her face. "My people have a saying," she said, "that the truest strength is the kind that does not need to announce itself." Kale looked at her. "That's a good saying." "You showed them something today that our military philosophy does not teach," she said. "Patience, gentleness, the willingness to heal before asking for anything." She paused. "Many of my people will think about that for a long time." Kale smiled a little. "I just did what felt right." Sariva looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded once and walked out. Kale stood alone in the quiet room for a few seconds. Then he went back outside. The night sky of Vorkai Prime was deep and clear, the stars sharp and unfamiliar above the dark mountain ridges. He walked to the enclosure and sat down near the fence. Rock moved to the inner edge and lay down on the other side of it, close as it could get. Kale leaned his back against the fence post and looked up at the alien sky. Around the compound, lights were still on in several buildings. Soldiers were finishing their evening routines. Somewhere across the outpost, someone was talking in low Vorkai tones. The place sounded the same as it always did, but it felt different, like something in it had shifted and settled into a new shape. He reached through the fence without looking and rested his hand on Rock's side.